Welcome, everyone, dear participants, and thank you for joining us for this session on business responsibility and collective action to uphold environmental rights. We're delighted to have you here with us. This session is organized by the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR. We have some fantastic speakers with us today, and we encourage all of you in the audience to participate by sending us your questions in the Q&A chat box. Please keep your questions concise and also let us know who you are and which speaker your question is for. So before we begin, allow me to quickly introduce myself. My name is Natalie Hymes. I coordinate the marine litter work in the Secretariat of the Coordinating Body on the Seas of East Asia, or COBSE, which is an intergovernmental body for the protection of the marine and coastal environment of the East Asian seas, and it's one of 18 regional seas programs. The COBSE Secretariat is administered by the United Nations Environment Programme and hosted by Thailand. So today's session explores business practices that protect both people and planet. We will discuss the responsibility of businesses to comply with international environmental and human rights standards. But why are we speaking about this topic now and at this forum? Human rights and the environment are intrinsically linked. Our well-being and health and our economic welfare depend on a safe and healthy environment. Alongside governments, businesses have a fundamental responsibility to protect these environmental rights. Improper business practices in our region threaten ecosystems that we depend on. They create hazardous waste and plastic pollution, and they contribute to air pollution and climate change. And these impacts are disproportionately felt by marginalized groups such as children, women, indigenous persons, and low-income communities. Responsible business conduct is also fundamental to building back better out of this pandemic. And UNEP advocates for human rights-based approaches to addressing environmental challenges. One example is the Regional Marine Litter Project Sea Circular that aims to prevent plastic pollution in Southeast Asia and is jointly implemented by UNEP and COBSE with support from the government of Sweden. So today we will discuss good business practices, the role of industry standards and policies to protect environmental rights. We will explore the causes and implications of non-compliance with international environmental and human rights standards, and we'll speak about collective action that businesses can take to meet these standards. So without further ado, allow me to introduce our fantastic speakers. I'm delighted to have Betty Yolanda with us today. Betty has been a human rights practitioner since 2004 and has worked on issues of transitional justice, civil and political rights, and economic, social, and cultural rights. Betty is the first ever Asia Regional Manager of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. And previously, she directed the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development and worked with public interest lawyers in Southeast Asia to engage in ASEAN human rights mechanisms. We also have Stephanie Venuti with us. She's a policy advisor and legal expert in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, in the Center for Responsible Business Conduct. And she leads the center's work on environmental objectives with a focus on climate change, and she works on promoting responsible supply chains in Asia. She's a qualified lawyer, and she's worked with governments, private sector, and CSOs across the region on these issues. I'm also delighted to have Sarini with us, Sarini Achavanantakun. She's a financier by training. She's a Thai writer, social critic, and sustainable business researcher, and she writes about civic empowerment and sustainable business in various media. She's co-founded Thai Publica and Self Forest, and she's now she heads the research team of Fair Finance Thailand, which is an initiative that assesses policies of leading financial institutions, including on human rights, and advocates for sustainable development. And last but certainly not least, we also have Hemanta Witanage with us, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Environmental Justice in Sri Lanka, which is a member of Friends of the Earth International. And Hemanta is also the international convener of the NGO Forum on Asian Development Bank He's been involved in environmental advocacy, citizen science, and litigation over the past 30 years. So welcome to all of our speakers. And a kind reminder to our audience, please do send us your questions in the Q&A chat box throughout. Keep them concise and let us know if your question is for a specific speaker. So let me now turn to Betty to start this discussion. Betty, you work with businesses on human rights issues on a daily basis. And you're also working with us under this executive project to build capacity of businesses for rights-based approaches to prevent plastic pollution. So what current trends do you see around the interlinkages between business conduct and rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? Betty, please, over to you. I think you're still muted.
So good day, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch break and are ready for this session. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this important panel. As has been introduced by Natalie, I work for the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, which is an independent nonprofit organization that tracks the human rights impacts of over 10,000 companies in over 180 countries. Just wanting to reflect on the question posed by Natalie on the interlinkages between business conduct and environmental rights, particularly right to safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I would like first to say that a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is critical to the full enjoyment of a wide range of human rights, including the rights to life, the right to health, food, water, and sanitation. The human rights to a healthy environment is currently recognized in more than 150 states through national constitutions, legislations, or international treaties. Looking at the annex of a report published by OECHR, I could see that the majority of countries in South Asia and as well as in Southeast Asia either explicitly guarantee the right to a healthy environment or have case law interpretations of existing human rights protections to include a right to a healthy environment, such as in Bangladesh, India, and Malaysia. What we are seeing today around the world confirms actually what the first UN Special Rapporteur on Toxic Waste in 1994 that stated that human rights violations lead to environmental degradations, and environmental degradation leads also to human rights violation. So a degraded environment indeed has far-reaching adverse human rights impact. Resource-rich countries, including many Asian countries, have attracted investments. In this regard, business operation impact human rights and the environment in many different ways. For example, polluting factories and environmental degradations have adverse impacts on one's right to a healthy and safe environment. Indigenous peoples or communities who have a distinct relationship with the environment and depend on it for their existence are at greater risk of suffering human rights violations due to environmental degradations. In 2020, Business and Human Rights Resource Center recorded 604 attacks against human rights defenders working on business-related human rights issues in 2020. More than a third stem from a lack consultations or the failure to secure free, prior, and informed consent of affected communities. 40% indigenous land and environmental defenders actually killed, according to Global Witness report in 2020. So human rights defenders who fight for a healthy environment actually have been a target of strategic lawsuits against public participations or SLAPs by businesses. With the exceptions of the Philippines, for example, in Southeast Asia, there is no regulations in any Southeast Asian countries that define SLAPs. In Indonesia, for example, Article 66 of Law number 32 of 2009 on environmental protections and management protects against lawsuits brought on those exercising their right to a healthy environment. In one slave cases in Thailand, for example, the court ruled that by protesting or putting up signs against an operations of a company, the defendants were asserting their constitutional right to a healthy environment. The UNGP on Business and Human Rights expect businesses to carry out due diligence, meaning that they should identify, prevent, mitigate, address human rights risks relevant to rights holders on an ongoing basis and communicate about their efforts in this regard. So communicating how impacts have been addressed through proactive disclosures by company is key to ensuring a better respect and protections of human rights and the environment. Responsible business conduct is very much linked to the undertaking of human rights and environmental due diligence. For example, at the international level, the 2017 French Duty of Vigilance Law, for example, requires French companies to establish and publish a vigilance plan with measures to identify risks and prevent human rights and environmental abuses linked to their activities and those of their subsidiaries, subcontractors, and suppliers. And the recent development of the mandatory human rights due diligence legislations at the EU level, which requests companies to conduct environmental and human rights due diligence along their full value chain, will provide better human rights and environmental protection. I also wanted to just cite a report by the UN Special Rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in 2018, which he presented the framework principles on human rights and the environment. These framework principles actually provide 3 sets of duties that engage both states and businesses. So under principles 8 and 12, for example, the framework stresses the responsibility of business enterprises under the UNGPs. With regard to our work in the region, in Southeast Asia, actually in 2019, we conducted a disclosure survey with 25 ASEAN agriculture companies, inviting them to share their company policies and statements on 3 issues. First, women economic empowerment, inclusive business, and climate resilience. So why we did this kind of survey? Because we believe that corporate transparency is key in driving corporate actions and behavior. So out of the 25 surveyed companies, only 7 companies actually have policies or statements on climate and climate resilience. Almost all these statements actually include waste management as a focus. One company from Thailand also include climate resilience statement, which also include the issue of recycle of plastic packaging. So as mentioned by Natalie in her introduction, I think it is also critical for us to look at different types of pollutions, including plastic pollution. So before I end my sharing, my presentations, I just wanted us not to forget plastic pollutions as one of the most serious environmental issues. So the plastics life cycle impacts the plastic life cycle actually impacts human rights at every stage, from extraction of plastic raw materials through their production, trade, disposal, and also their afterlife. So in this regard, actually businesses should change their business model that heavily relies on single-use plastic. Being transparent about their plastic footprint, for example, is the first step towards preventing plastic waste and pollution. And just one last comment from me is that solutions to tackling environmental issues require states and businesses to integrate not only transparency, but also the right to participation, access to adequate information, as well as the right to an effective remedy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty, for these fantastic insights. Let me now turn to our next speaker, and we'll come back to some of the issues that you've already raised. But I'd like to hear from Stephanie. You work with a range of actors on promoting responsible supply chains in Asia. So what tools and initiatives can help companies to identify good practices and uphold environmental rights? Over to you, Stephanie.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and thank you very much for the organisers of this this session for inviting us to come and speak today on this really important topic. So today my focus is going to be around the role of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct, and the role that these instruments play in supporting environmental and human rights issues to be addressed by business, and particularly in the context of climate change. I'll also highlight some of our current and future work on this area and showcase some practical examples and policy trends that we're seeing. Some were already mentioned by Betty, that look at the intersection between human rights and environment in the context of responsible business conduct, or what we expect from business aligned with international expectations. So for those that might not be so familiar with the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, they're a policy instrument that enshrines recommendations from governments to business on how businesses should be contributing positively to sustainable development, but also at the same time ensuring that they're addressing their adverse impacts and risks on people on the planet. So it's an outward-looking expectation. Today, the guidelines represent international consensus on what is responsible business conduct, spanning all areas of business risk and responsibility, and they're backed by almost 50 governments globally now, including both OECD and non-OECD member countries, and have been informed and progressively developed by business, trade unions, NGOs, and governments. Importantly for this discussion today, the guidelines offer an international standard on RBC that's comprehensive, so that when I mentioned before that they cover all areas of business risk and responsibility, that means they include a dedicated chapter on environmental related expectations, as well as a dedicated chapter on human rights, which mirrors the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, but also a number of other chapters that are relevant to environment and human rights considerations, including chapters on consumer interests, science and technology, disclosure, and others. So the guidelines include, as I mentioned, recommendations across those different chapters that really highlight both substantive and procedural environmental rights issues or considerations that businesses should take into account. I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples from the environment chapter in particular. So that chapter references, it expressly references that the chapter should reflect the principles and objectives of the Rio Declaration, and also the Aarhus Convention on access to information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. Now, although the guidelines doesn't go into detail about how these conventions should apply necessarily to business, it is important that they are mentioned in terms of how national contact points may well then go and interpret and apply the provisions of the guidelines. And I'll talk to the role of the national contact points a little bit more shortly. Just another example taken from the environment chapter of the guidelines is that it highlights information sharing about business activities and their environmental impacts as a really important tool for building confidence, trust, and understanding of environmental issues with the public. And the environment chapter, in a similar vein, also promotes training and education to meet this responsibility. So the role of the guidelines also include an expectation that business conducts supply chain due diligence and in order to identify and address their adverse impacts. And the role of OECD due diligence guidance in helping companies identify good practice to uphold environmental rights is something that I will talk to a little bit more shortly as well. So before I quickly do, I want to touch on the national contact points that I mentioned earlier as a body in providing guidance for business on this topic, and also highlight a recent case that was handled by the Netherlands Court of Justice, handed down by the Netherlands Court of Justice just last week. So circling back a little bit, for those who may not be so familiar with national contact points or NCPs, governments that adhere to the guidelines also commit to establishing a national contact point, which has the dual purpose of promoting the guidelines, but also to decide alleged cases where a company may have breached certain recommendations of the guidelines. So demonstrating the nexus between environment and human rights recommendations, here, the majority of NCP cases filed that relate to environmental matters, in fact, almost always also cite the human rights chapter of the guidelines. So there's always that interconnection that's coming up when cases are being brought to NCPs. One example is a 2012 case regarding a Norwegian M&E, which had built a wind power plant on a reindeer herding ground in Sweden. It's also an example of climate and just transition considerations as well regarding renewable energy. But in this case, due to disrupting the habitat of the local reindeer population, the complainant stated that the company had not taken necessary steps to prevent the negative impacts allegedly affecting the traditional livelihoods of an Indigenous group, which actually relied on reindeer herding for sustenance, and thus potentially displacing community members from their grounds. The NCPs of Sweden and Norway in this case noted that the company could in fact further improve its promotion of Indigenous people's rights and implementation of the OECD guidelines in this case, which then resulted in an agreement amongst parties following mediation. And as I mentioned, another example that I wanted to highlight here is the landmark judgment that was handed by the Netherlands Court of Justice just last week, ruling that Royal Dutch Shell must reduce CO2 emissions by 45% by 2030 compared to 2019 levels across scopes 1, 2, and 3. And requiring this emissions reduction obligation, the court found that Royal Dutch showed an unwritten standard of care to society in line with the Dutch Civil Code and human rights obligations, with particular focus on the right to life. And in understanding the standard of care and how it should be applied by business in this case, the court specifically drew on a number of international soft law instruments, including the OECD guidelines, as well as the UNGPs and others, and found that Royal Dutch Shell, their current corporate policy was not consistent with a global climate target to prevent dangerous climate change for the protection of humankind and nature. So it's a really good example of bringing together those two, the two sides, so the environment and the human rights side of the climate and the human rights side. So in closing, I just want to note, in terms of what we're seeing at the OECD Centre for Responsible Business Conduct, there is still room to unpack and illustrate how these provisions that are outlined in the OECD guidelines, but also OECD guidance on due diligence, can be implemented in practice by business, particularly when they're looking at intersections between different areas of risk, particularly human rights and environment. We're actually working together now with a number of partners, including UNEP and UNFCCC, in developing what we're calling practical tools, which are for the purposes of helping business or to demonstrate to business how different steps or processes that are outlined in OECD due diligence guidance tools can be applied practically when a business is navigating these specific types of environmental risk with a particular focus on climate change. And importantly, these tools will also highlight interlinkages between human rights and those environmental risks that they address to help business understand what practical actions they might take in addressing those issues. And this is also becoming particularly critical in light of the recent policy and legislative trends that we're seeing to promote RBC or a comprehensive approach to RBC, responsible business conduct. And one example that I'll note quickly now before I finish is the EU Commission's initiative to introduce mandatory rules requiring companies now to carry out environment and human rights due diligence. So again, it's a comprehensive approach to the two areas of risk. And the European Commission, Parliament and Council have all noted that the future rules will be rooted in the OECD guidelines and recommendations of OECD due diligence guidance. So I'll end there, but happy to answer any questions, and it's our pleasure to be part of this discussion, and we look forward to working with all of you in taking this work forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Also for sharing so many examples. I think that really helps to make tangible that this is really an issue that is of importance globally, and hopefully also increase in importance in the region as well. So we'll get back to some of these issues, but I'd now also like to turn to Sarini. You promote sustainable business practices and sustainable finance. So in your experience, what are some of the proactive steps that companies can take to protect vulnerable groups and their rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment? Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Natalie, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to share with my experience today. And I think the two previous speakers, Betty and Stephanie, already mentioned some very important points. Before going to what companies can do and some of what we have observed from Fair Finance Thailand work, I'd like to mention two, I think, very important reasons that we are seeing increased awareness of companies on human rights, especially in Thailand. So one is definitely a stronger or more focus on the legal requirements. I think that, as Stephanie mentioned, the Shell court case is very important. It's historical. I think the first time that company is basically being ordered to take into account their climate responsibility. So I think before, companies looked at their climate responsibility as more of a compliance lens. So, for example, many companies in Thailand and also banks, they say, well, whatever the government wants us to do, just mandate that as regulations. And so we will follow what the regulations say. But I think something like what the Netherlands court with the Shell case, I think made it clear that the importance of looking at human rights as a responsibility of companies. So I think this is something that will have repercussion. And I think this is something that companies in Asia will also be closely following. As well as that, I think in Asia, there's an increasing awareness of human rights as a key focus of responsibility of business. And in Thailand, for example, a few years ago, the government announced the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And that basically, I think it's quite a high level kind of document, but at least it mandates some government entities like the Securities Exchange Commission to encourage listed companies in Thailand, including financial institutions, to carry out human rights due diligence. And so with this trend in Europe, where it seems that EU is moving towards a mandatory due diligence, that will have repercussion to Thai companies as well, because many of our companies export to Europe, or the companies are part of the supply chain in Europe. So I think these are kind of some of the legal requirements or trends that basically will force companies to look at human rights at the more holistic and comprehensive picture. I think before, many of the Asian companies only look at human rights as a kind of, they look at it through, again, I said, lens of legal compliance. They understand labor rights, for example, more clearly than environmental rights, which are, I think, more difficult for them to perceive. So I think that's one trend. Another trend is, I think that right now, especially in the banking industry, there are increasing talks about standards pertaining to environmental risk. For example, in Thailand, there's a lot of discussion now around ESG, environmental, social, and governance risk. Many countries are developing green taxonomy to basically standardize a lot of the green terminology. I think that they will move towards brown taxonomy as well to encourage companies to reduce the negative impacts. So I think that's another kind of development that will increase companies' interest. So I think together the two trends combined, both the stronger legal focus or legal requirements, as well as the more stronger kind of standards, will push companies to look at human rights, including environmental rights. And so I think there are three things that companies can be more proactive in doing, and I think some of these will relate to the work we have done as Fair Finance Thailand. So number one is, I think the attitude needs to be changed. I think a lot of people already mentioned human rights-based approach to corporate strategy. I think there needs to be more focus on that. And especially now when companies talk about ESG risk, ESG risk and risk management, I think they should look at environmental rights protection as a kind of key minimum requirement or a necessary or integral part of their risk management process. And so I think that has to start at that level so that companies can make these linkages. In our most recent assessment of the policies of 8 financial institutions, private banks in Thailand, and 4 government banks in Thailand. So this is based on last year's data. We found that there are 5 banks that actually announced climate change emission targets, but we only give scores to 3 banks out of 5 because the other 2 we felt that their commitment was too low. They did not even announce to the level of the national commitment of the country. And so that's 3 out of 5. In terms of human rights, out of the 12 banks, there were 5 banks that we gave some scores. So all 5 banks, we scored them based on their announcement that they will adhere to the UNGP, the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. But again, the scores vary because out of the 5 banks, they only basically score at the basic level. One bank scored a bit higher because they mentioned that they expect the suppliers of their clients to adhere to the UNGP as well. And then there's one bank that got almost half the scores in this category because they actually laid out the steps and the basically the remedy procedures and the complaints procedure that they expect the clients to have. And they also mentioned precautionary principle. So again, this is, I think, the challenge that we see, I think in Thailand and also many Asian countries, is that even when companies are, now more aware that they have to put more effort, that they have to be more responsible to human rights, it's a question of how much is enough and what exactly are the steps they can take. So I think, to us, I think the first step needs to start with really looking at environmental rights protection as a key part of the risk management strategy. And following from that is the importance of protecting and engaging stakeholders, especially the vulnerable groups in the areas of businesses, seeing them not as a group to protect, but also as important stakeholders who can advise on potential environmental risks that the companies may have. I think, as Betty mentioned, it's unfortunate that in Asia there are still many SLAPP cases, basically human rights defender being prosecuted, being sued. And I think that has to be very clearly, basically had to be seen by companies. They have to make very strong statement that they will not, prosecute human rights defenders, and they will accord respect to human rights defenders as important stakeholders that will, give very strong and very good advice to the company's ESG risk management process. So I think actually in Thailand there's a SLAPP law, but it's very difficult to use as I understand from our lawyers, and it's also still not possible for you to sue government officials, for example. So I think there's still a lot of gaps in implementation. So I would say stakeholder protection is key, another key area, but needs to be elevated to proactive stakeholder engagement to see them as, an important part of the whole ESG process. We have discussed with a few companies in Thailand who have begun the human rights due diligence, human rights impact assessment process. And I think one challenge we found, this is what they told us, is that oftentimes they were afraid of the potential legal liabilities or ramifications. So they would kind of prefer to keep this process as in-house as possible. And so they did not reach out, to as many vulnerable groups or the stakeholders as should be the case. So I think this kind of hesitancy, this kind of reluctance is something that that businesses can and should actually join forces, with the competitors, with the other companies in the same industry, to go to the Human Rights Commission and other human rights experts like BHR, for example, to basically, find out how to do proper human rights due diligence and how to draw up like a kind of a transition plan, doing it like a step-by-step process. So I think my second point is really about the importance of involving stakeholder, but not only seeing them as vulnerable groups to protect, but also key inputs in the whole risk management process going forward. And I think the last item that is, I think, a must for companies to do now is around the idea of better disclosure. Because I think in our experience, one reason companies are not sure about how or what they should be doing in terms of human rights and environmental rights is that they're not sure what the expectations are. So I think in that regard, I think companies can basically push for better disclosure and better standards. For example, in Thailand, several groups, the civil society already advocating for Clean Air Act, as well as the PRTR, the Pollutants Release and Transfer Registry disclosure. In the banking industry, I think the Bank of Thailand is soon going to study the climate change disclosures, the standards made by the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, as well as the various green taxonomies and potential brown taxonomies floating. So I think that these kinds of standards, these kinds of disclosures need to be linked, need to be basically involving human rights defenders and environmental rights activists to make sure that they are based on very real and actionable points. Just a last example before I finish. In Thailand, a couple of years ago, the Thai Bankers Association released this document called the Responsible Lending Guidelines. And so this is signed by all the banks in Thailand. In that document, it sets out high-level 4 principles that banks have to adhere to. And so one principle talks about engaging stakeholders on what they call key ESG issue. And then the other item in that talks about integrating, proper standards and plans and procedures in the bank's own operation. So I think the word, engaging stakeholders on key ESG issue, this is an opportunity for businesses to reach out to environmental rights activists and lawyers and vulnerable groups to make sure that they understand the impacts of the business. Because a lot of the environmental impact, I think, are quite complicated as well. Like in Thailand now, there's transboundary haze issue and air pollution, whereby it's not just the source is not inside Thailand anymore. So I think the more complex the issue becomes, and the more basically wide-reaching the impact, then it's more necessary for businesses to collaborate with many different actors and human rights defenders and activists, as well as their own competitors, instead of kind of keeping everything in-house.
Great. Thank you so much also for those fantastic examples and highlighting those steps that companies can take. Let me now turn to our last speaker, to Hemanta. So Hemanta, in a recent case you were involved in Sri Lanka that I heard of, a court had ordered to send back waste containers with waste imported from the UK. So it sounds like, in your many years of environmental advocacy, you've gained a lot of experience. So what role would you say does civil society have in calling for business responsibility and collective action to uphold these environmental rights? How can civil society organizations really engage with businesses, as Harinij had just mentioned? Over to you, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Actually, we are suffering a huge environmental damage these days because of the ship fire just in the Colombo Harbor. That's only about 9 nautical miles from Colombo Harbor, and more than 200-kilometer coastal stretch is already filled with a lot of plastic pellets. And there are many chemicals, including nitric acid, methanol, and sodium methoxide, and some environmentally harmful substances have been carried in this ship. Of course, Sri Lanka is located in the Indian Ocean, next to the one of the most busiest shipping route. There are a lot of ships moving with a lot of waste. And in 2019, we have found that there's a lot of containers found in one of the terminal in Colombo Harbor with waste imported from United Kingdom. And it was initially identified as 130 containers, but lately they also found there are other containers in another location, which is in an industrial park near the airport area. So altogether, so we knew that there are 263 containers which were imported during 2017 and 2019, and all of them seems to be carrying waste mattresses, carpets, and which are the post-consumer waste under the Basel Convention. So when we found that, so we thought that the government processes are very, very slow. So therefore, without having a civil society intervention, it will be hard for us to take legal action and send them back to the origin. So that's the point. We have decided to file the legal action in the Court of Appeal. And one of the issue was that some of the companies who imported, they say it's a genuine business and they want to do the recycling, and they want to sell them in some other countries like India or other countries once they value add to these items. But we found value adding is not possible because these are like they were doing the junkyard process. So in the court we have asked the court to intervene and send all of these containers back to the United Kingdom. Fortunately, the Basel focal point in Sri Lanka, the Central Environmental Authority, and the Basel focal point in the United Kingdom, so they both agreed to take them back, and so therefore we have withdrawn the case with the conditions that they have to take legal action against those companies involved behind the illegal importation of these waste, and also send all these waste containers back to the origin. So as far as we know that part of these containers have been already repatriated to the United Kingdom, but still some are available, and there so far we haven't seen any legal action filed. So this brings me to the issue about human rights when it comes to the business sector, and to my understanding that human rights in the business sector is not very much spoken subject in Sri Lanka until very recent, because Sri Lanka was in a civil war more than 30 years, and always the human rights is related to the war-related human rights. But in the recent years, we have been listening about how the human rights issue has been taken in the business sector as well. There's one incident that when the people start demonstrating against one of the factory, which they think that the factory got involved in polluting their drinking water, and the pH level was like below 3.2, 3.2, and there was a police shooting, and three people died, and several others got wounded. And this is one of the clear occasions that how the human rights violations have happened. But in other cases, like the normal procedure for us to make sure that the industries are respecting to the health, environmental and human rights conditions are the environmental protection license procedure. In one example, the Kalandi River, which is flowing to the ocean near Colombo, so there are, according to the Auditor General's report, there are at least 10,518 industries are located, but recently they did a audit with 2,946 industries, and they found there are 41 category A industries also there. And they found out of these factories, there are 205 industries are operating even after cancelling the environmental protection license. So that means they're not respecting to the human rights, environmental rights, or the health rights of the local communities. What, as a civil society organization, we have been engaging in the last several years, almost last 2 decades, how citizens can engage in making sure that industries respect to the national standards, respect to the laws, and also to the international standards. So we have started doing this citizen science program, which we voluntarily test the various products. For example, with the support of the International Pollution Elimination Network, IPEN. So we have conducted various research on lead levels in paint, mercury levels in hair samples, and also mercury levels in certain products, including this whitening cream. There are many number of products we have tested, and we filed the legal action in the court of law, asking the government to intervene to bring the lead paint standards. When we done this test in 2009, we found one of the paint sample had 135,000 parts per million lead in just a wall paint. It's an emulsion paint. So when we filed the legal action, we were able to bring it to down to the WHO standard. The Consumer Affairs Authority and the Health Ministry, they all agreed to gazette this new standard, putting 90 parts per million for the emulsion paint and 600 parts per million for enamel paint. So since then, this case was filed in 2011. In 2013, the law was enacted. So all these years until 2017, annually we have tested more than 100 paint samples from the market, and we have realized that the level of lead is going down. And after 2015, we didn't find, except 1 or 2 samples, we didn't find lead in the market paint. So after that, we have initiated this third-party certification process. At least at the moment, one company got involved in the third-party certification, where annual testing is done in the United States. So we collect samples and send them all the samples, preparated samples. So that way we keep monitoring on the industry. So that's one good approach. I don't know how many industries, how many products we can keep doing this kind of citizens engagement, but this is a very good example. The unfortunate thing is that some of those industries are producing goods for the European market and the US markets with all the strict control, but when they produce the same product into the local market, they have a double standard. So I think when it comes to the human rights issues in this business sector, definitely we have some tools. Of course, as a developing country, we are more trusted on the law enforcement, but these certifications and the various guidelines are very important. Unless we have a strong law enforcement, it's very hard to keep that. So we still trust on the democratic institutions, like the government agencies, as well as the court of law, to make sure that the businesses are respecting to the human rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much again also for these rich examples from Sri Lanka, and for explaining also how consumers and all of us can help to hold businesses accountable, and to also nudge governments to do more and to improve their law enforcement. So thank you so much for that. We do have quite a few questions coming in, so let us now turn to you, our audience, to hear from you and what is on your mind. We had a question coming in asking what the level of awareness is of businesses and corporations in the Asia Pacific region, awareness for tools that are available to support them to address their environmental and human rights obligations. So this is actually something that you spoke about briefly, Sarini. So maybe you could answer this question over time, what awareness maybe has changed to tools that are there.
Okay, sure. Thank you. I'm not sure if I can speak for the other countries because mostly our experience is just for Thailand and maybe the neighboring countries that Thai companies have invested in, like Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam to some extent. But I would say that as I mentioned, there are the issue itself or the human rights. I think many businesses now are aware that they have to pay attention beyond the lens of legal compliance or just adhering to the laws, and that's partly because of the promotion by the Stock Exchange of Thailand and the Securities Exchange Commission of Thailand as well in trying to promote the UNGP, and also attempts by OECHR as well as UNDP and many of the multinational agencies to increase this awareness among companies. But as far as what tools are available to them, I think this is still something that they are very much trying to tap into. As someone who has conducted a few training sessions to companies on human rights due diligence, we ourselves have had a hard time, I guess, finding the toolkit or the due diligence handbooks that are easily digestible for Thai companies. And I think I would say two challenging issues. So one is that many companies feel that only the largest companies, only the most kind of well endowed can afford to do a kind of comprehensive human rights due diligence. So I think now there's a discussion. I think there needs to be more, we need to do more discussion and think of ways how can SMEs or the smaller companies in the supply chain of larger companies can take part, and basically be be more responsible without them feeling that this would be very detrimental to their business in some way. How can we allocate, so to speak, the resources to get companies, of different sizes in the supply chain to improve? I think this is something that needs to be more discussed, and I think tools need to also be more, maybe tools need to be more mindful of the differences in the company resources and awareness as well. So that's one thing. I would say the second challenge, I would say, is the complex nature of environmental damage. I think to a certain extent, companies in Thailand understand that we have to basically take care of the welfare of communities around the factories or around the workplace. I think this is something that basically companies, when you talk about that, they kind of pretty much know what to do, or at least they know how to engage. But when we talk about more complex issue like transboundary haze, or climate change, for example, or like waste, impact of waste downstream, I think that is something that needs to be a lot more clarity, I think, at the policy level as well, not just from the business level. The issue of waste that Hermanta mentioned is also a very big problem in Thailand. And I think some companies want to do their part, but they are frustrated of the lack of kind of the coordinated policy approach. Because if you just allow some companies to be more responsible out of their own willingness, then it basically creates a kind of unlevel playing field. So I think that this is something that needs to be discussed both at the policy and the business side. Just one last example I want to leave the audience with. I mentioned the Clean Air Act as a kind of example of something that Thai people try to push for. Interestingly, we have several drafts of this law floating. One draft of the Clean Air Act is actually being proposed by the Thai Business Association. So I think this is basically the first time that I see that business association together proposed kind of a legislation, a social piece of legislation. So I think this is how aware I think people are of some of the more pressing environmental concerns, so that even businesses are willing to step up. Yeah, so I think there need to be more tools that, again, take into account the different sizes and resources, and also more clear, I guess, sector-specific standards for them to follow. Yeah, because many people told me the UNGP isn't an easy document to use. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for raising this issue, and just to mention that we are actually working with UNDP, OECD, OHCHR, and also regional partners, including Betty and colleagues, to develop a better toolkit that has this information on human rights and environmental rights, and also to develop capacity building and training that makes this, as you said, more digestible and more action oriented for businesses and also for governments. So this is coming up this year as well, led by UNEP. So we're happy to share more information on that as well. Thank you for highlighting these points. We do have quite a few questions, so I might move on. And there's been a question, how disclosure requirements have enabled greater compliance with human rights in Southeast Asia, and if there are maybe any examples, and where pressure or incentives for companies really do also create change. I'm wondering, maybe Betty, whether you would like to take this question, but any other speakers also very welcome to chip in.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. So one way that we, push companies to disclose, their human rights policies or statements is through, various means, and also including through our, mechanism, what we call company response mechanism, where we push company to respond to allegations of, human rights and environmental violations. And actually, the idea of this mechanism is for us, as an organization, to take up allegations of abuse and seek remedy to companies. And through this mechanism, actually, we push companies to be more transparent and responsive to human rights allegations. But I must say that the results really vary in terms of whether victims that shared the allegations with us really receive the results of the remedy from the companies. But what I want to say here is that while a response from companies when it comes to policies or statements on human rights, or their responses to allegations of human rights violations, although such response does not always lead to action, but it does indicate the company's willingness to engage publicly with concerns raised by human rights advocates, or civil society, and provides a public statement that the company can be held accountable to. So in terms of the disclosure requirements, whether that have enabled greater compliance with human rights in Southeast Asia, again, it really varies, and also to us, pushing companies to be more transparent is the first step to ensuring actions by companies. And just wanted to also, if I may, to respond to the first question that has been answered. So in terms of the level of awareness of business and corporations in the region, I think one thing that we need to also take into consideration is that many countries in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia and also in South Asia, are currently developing their national action plan on business and human rights. And one process to see and also to check on the level of awareness of businesses and corporations in the region when it comes to tools available for them to address environmental and human rights obligations are through the development of the baseline assessment, national baseline assessment, prior to the development of the national action plan. I could say this because, for example, we were involved in helping to put together the national baseline assessment for the development of the National Action Plan for Bangladesh. And we could see, from the survey that we conducted, at least we could see, the level of awareness of, local companies, local corporations, as well as industry associations when it comes to the issue of business and human rights. And I think, baseline study will also contribute to increasing awareness of topics involved in the new and the developing areas of business and human rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Betty, for that addition. And I think that's really valuable as well to see that transparency is the first step towards accountability. And thank you for raising again also these national action plans, which are very important. We have a few more questions coming in. There's one specifically for Stephanie on whether the national contact points also cover issues around multinational enterprises or how transboundary cases can be addressed and resolved. Is this something that you could provide a bit more information on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So as I mentioned briefly in my remarks, the national contact points they're a state-based non-judicial grievance mechanism that can handle complaints with relation to alleged breaches of the guidelines. Now, the guidelines apply to M&Es, but they also apply to all business of all sizes. So in that sense, in fact, the answer is yes, they can handle a case relating to M&Es, but also businesses across all sizes. And in terms of the transboundary nature, so NCPs inherently have a transboundary component to what they do, because you can bring a case to an NCP if a business is operating in or from the country where the NCP is located. So then, as I mentioned, the NCPs are established by all governments that have committed to adhere to the guidelines. So they're located across the world. There's many of them now, but in the region, there's Korea and Japan, which are OECD adherents to the guidelines and members. So they each have a national contact point. And if I may, just while I have the floor, I just wanted to add to some of the points that were raised earlier about the speakers and from the speakers about building awareness and practical support for business on environment and human rights issues or environmental rights issues. And one point I wanted to make that we're seeing as well across our work in Asia under the Responsible Supply Chains in Asia program that we do in partnership with ILO and EU, but also in terms of our more broader work that we're seeing across other regions, is a need for business to understand the integration between environment and human rights due diligence, rather than just human rights due diligence, but thinking of it more as a comprehensive approach to environment and human rights. And that's the way that we're seeing policy and legislative trends heading to. So I think that's something that there may need to be a bit more awareness building around that aspect and what those two due diligence processes mean. There's many similarities and synergies between the two. There are some points of difference, but there's also a lot of cross-learning and mutually reinforcing principles that are relevant to both practices that I think can be further highlighted and supported for business. And that's something that we're doing through our work in tracking regulatory developments that are happening, but also in terms of building those practical tools that I mentioned, which really illustrate how to implement each step of the due diligence process when you're looking specifically at through the lens of an environmental risk. And then, of course, through that lens, you need to be considering also the intersections with human rights as well. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much for those additions, Stephanie, for answering that question. We have a question also specifically for Hemanta on whether you have faced any challenges also from businesses when trying to initiate legal action. Maybe you can share a little bit some of the challenges and issues that you have faced in your work.
You mean like a SLUT suit? So we haven't got any kind of legal action against us at the moment, but there are a few other the people got similar cases. For example, one of our client, he was fighting against the mini hydro companies, and then he was unable to stop the project, although it was killing the river just behind their backyard. So the people involved in the mini hydro case. So they have filed the lawsuit against this villager, asking 15.6 million compensation for stopping this project. I had several letter of demands asking in one time 2,000 million from me, but there was no case filed. So so we are very careful when we are handling with the companies, definitely, because it's always we have to depend on a lot of science-based evidence, the facts-based evidence. Unless we do our campaign right, so then we will be in that sort of a trouble. I also want to add a little bit about the awareness. Recently, we conducted a project with the UNDP Sri Lanka to build the awareness material and also produce the policy material as well as some education material. And we come to know that the big companies, for example, the blue chip companies, have a better understanding about the various the requirements, and they do the due diligence. But at the same time, so we found certain big blue chip companies also so violate. For example, one of the companies got involved dumping their waste material into the ocean through a sewage pumping station. But the problem is also with the government, because the government has not provided a facility so far for dealing with the liquid waste. Even the solid waste handling is a real problem in Sri Lanka unless you have those facilities available. So we cannot also complain about the businesses. So the government has to do this infrastructure. But when it comes to the small scale enterprises, they don't have much understanding about the standards or the business and human rights or the UNGP angles. So they are very small companies, sometimes like 20-30 people are working. And also when it comes to the organized labor work, we found that only about 20% of the labor force is organized in Sri Lanka. 80% don't have any organized activity. So it's a fairly very different level of understanding, awareness between the small enterprises as well as the big companies.
Great, thank you so much, and also for highlighting that this is, of course, a shared responsibility between businesses and governments as well. You need to create an enabling environment, and for highlighting some of the risks that environmental rights defenders can also face when going up against companies. There's a related question also for Serini about what the challenges are that fair finance has faced when trying to obtain data or information from banks that you were collecting, as you mentioned, and what actual impact is of announcing ranking and scores. So has there been positive change, and what challenges have you faced when you were ranking these banks and getting that information? Serini, please could you share?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, thank you, Natalie. So Fair Finance Thailand uses the Fair Finance Guide methodology developed by Fair Finance Guide International in the Netherlands. So we're actually part of the 13 countries network. And I think one positive thing, or at least that makes it easier for us to use, is that the Fair Finance Guide methodology only assess the public disclosures, so public policies of banks. So in that sense, whether if we cannot find any data according to the methodology, we just basically give them 0 score. So I think in that regard, we don't really go and ask for any kind of hidden or non-public information. But I think the process that we work has really allowed banks to see us in a positive light, because each year we have done this for 3 years already. So each year we would go through the public disclosures and different reports, and then we would have a kind of hearing period where we send these draft scores to each of the banks. And then that would be the period where many banks would respond, and some banks would say we actually disclosed this already. Some other banks will ask about they want to know usually what their competitor, what their closest competitor is doing. So usually we don't disclose the names of the banks before we can announce the whole thing, but we can say, in this category, you are the one of the 3 banks that did not disclose any policies. And so that creates, I think, a kind of a positive virtuous cycle in a way, that banks, at least the top 5 banks that we see, are really trying to compete with one another in disclosing based on the fair finance methodology. Of course, the challenge is that, once basically banks have kind of stepped up the disclosure, but it's still, in the whole scheme of things, relatively low. Like as I mentioned, the actual climate change category and the human rights category, the overall score is quite low. So the challenge is how to get all these banks to kind of go further than that, because going further means developing real credit policies, and actually integrating human rights in their approaches. So this is really a work in progress, but I think one at least benefit we have in Thailand is that there's a national action plan already announced, and the Bank of Thailand is quite supportive in pushing for more disclosures and adherence with the responsible lending guidelines, because according to the guidelines, banks have to announce, every year their progress in doing it. So we try to get them to see that fair finance guide and our scoring results can help them, can be a kind of tool to help them plan towards better transparency and better human rights policies.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. I know that Stephanie has to run, so I'd actually like to give you the opportunity to say, a last sentence or two before you have to go. Stephanie, please.
Thank you so much, Natalie. And sorry, I have to jump off the webinar because it's been such a fascinating discussion and really interesting questions from the audience, actually. And I think we could have a whole nother session running through those. But I think just a couple of points further to what I raised before for us, and I think what the discussion has really highlighted is there is still a need to further integrate the 2 sides, so the environmental side of things and the human rights side of things, and then to understand the interconnections between the 2. And importantly, I think that needs to happen for policymakers, but there's also an integration that needs to happen for business in terms of how those linkages should be mainstreamed into their risk management processes and actually integrated into the business decisions that they're making, both in terms of their direct operations, but also across their supply chain. So that's kind of the perspective that we take with responsible business conduct, because we do have a full supply chain approach, and we have the OECD due diligence guidance on responsible business conduct, which helps business understand, in fact, really key steps and practical steps that they can take to integrate broad RBC considerations into their risk management processes and frameworks. And I think there is further work that needs to be done there on mapping out and understanding what the human rights and environmental or environmental rights interlinkages look like, why it's important for business, and how they can be integrated into that broader risk management framework and the standards that are currently already available for business. So how the business can then take those forward to ensure that the interlinkages between the 2 areas of risk and impact are in fact not being forgotten or not slipping through the cracks, but are also being prioritized. And I have to say, I think events like this are really key in starting that process, or I should say continuing that process. It's not the first time, but I think it's important that we're coming together and discussing these issues and helping to raise awareness around it, which was one of the questions that was raised. In fact, this need to continue to build awareness. And from my side, I certainly do see that awareness increasing, and the interest and understanding of these issues is really increasing. There's a lot of momentum now around this. So I'm really happy that we're discussing this and looking forward to taking this work, to continuing this work with everyone on the call, on the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, for that brilliant summary and those issues that we still need to tackle going forward. Thank you so much for joining us. I would like to turn back to the other speakers as well and ask kind of a general question to all of you. You've already highlighted a few examples of specific steps that businesses can take to better uphold environmental rights and also to engage with stakeholders. But I'd like to, before we end, give you all the opportunity again to highlight, any specific examples, some very practical recommendations for businesses and what environmental rights really mean for improving business conduct. In light also of what Stephanie has just said, that we need to better integrate human rights and environmental issues. So what do environmental rights really mean in this respect? And do you have any very specific recommendations, practical way forward for businesses to uphold these rights? Let's maybe start with Hemanta, and then we'll go over to Betty and Serini. Please, over to you.
Thank you. I think it's a very good question. To my understanding, the industries are working on their own, so there's no disclosure happening except in very few cases. During the recent research we have conducted, even the government entities, the regulatory bodies don't have all the information about how the industrial practices, and they're using the legal tools like the environmental protection license or even the environmental impact assessment process, where the local people can engage in decision making. They're not using that as a tool to improve their practices, the human rights, environmental and health situations, but in fact they're using them as another approval for them to run the business. I think this practice has to stop. So definitely the civil society organizations can play a very good role of helping those industries or the businesses to understand what human rights issues, what environmental rights issues, or other health issues we are concerned when it comes to such practices. So I think that way, if we improve the communication among the three sectors, definitely we can help. So we cannot expect the businesses just run alone and respect to the UNGP. So therefore, I think this kind of relationship building is the very important aspect. So then the disclosure issues are really important. I think if that is the case, then so we can take legal enforcement as the last resort, but at the moment, because we don't have good communication, there's no disclosure, definitely. We first think about the legal approach. So I think so we have to turn it in the other way. I hope these kind of sessions will improve that relationships, and businesses will understand how they can do a better job, especially because we are losing the resources, and we are killing the earth in a very, very high speed. And this is not the way for the sustainable businesses or to keep the sustainable earth for our future generation. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Hemanta. Betty, would you like to share with us any practical recommendations and an outlook, maybe to sort of start wrapping up this session?
Thanks, Natalie. So I think I just wanted to emphasize on the last pillar of the UNGP, because we discuss about states' obligation when it comes to business and human rights, business responsibility to respect human rights. But as I shared earlier in my intervention, solutions to tackling environmental issues should integrate the right to participation, access to information, and the right to an effective remedy. So I think access to information is a necessary right to prevent and remedy corporate abuses of human rights. And if victims are to have meaningful access to remedy, they must be able to obtain all relevant information about processes and decisions linked to environmental harm. And I think this was raised in the plenary discussion yesterday by Dante. When state failed to fulfill their obligations, and then when companies failed to fulfill their responsibilities to respect human rights, what is left is the right to remedy, right? So I think in this regard, companies should also demonstrate the effectiveness of their grievance mechanisms, and also ensuring that positive outcomes for those whose rights have been violated to having a healthy environment, among others, should be the ultimate goal. So effective remedy should be informed by the perspective of rights holders who have been harmed, and ensuring that the harm and the root causes are appropriately identified and also addressed by both states and also companies.
Great. Thank you so much, Betty, for highlighting these issues again, and also the step of access to redress and mechanisms for remedying situations. That is an important step that we also need to take. Serini, over to you as well, if you have any sort of final remarks, some final recommendations that you'd like to share with us. I think you may still be muted.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I'm trying to think about what I should say, that not to repeat what the other speakers have said. I think I can add maybe 3 suggestions to businesses. So number one, it is very important. I would like to stress again the disclosure. I think we are now living in the age of radical transparency. This is what the consumers expect. This is what civil society expects. So businesses that are very, I think, very focused on really making, being responsible on human rights should improve the level of disclosure. And this can be things from, for example, the environmental impact assessments. In Thailand, I think we are now about to move away from just seeing it as a kind of a legal document that nobody is allowed to see. I think some companies are already thinking about disclosing it to at least the affected communities, and kind of making sure that all the concerns are heard in advance. I think there are a lot to be done still on the principle of FPIC, the free, prior, informed consent, the process of public hearing, the process of listening to affected stakeholders. I think this is something that business can really step in, in the absence of clear regulations on this. In Thailand, businesses who believe they have the best practice, or they want to know what the best practice are like, can step in and form this kind of maybe a best hearing best practice, best practice in disclosing environmental impact assessments, draft reports, for example, push for regulations, legislation that will improve disclosures, that will impel, better environmental rights protection across the board, like the Clean Air Act, that already the Thai Business Association is backing, as well as PRTR and related. So I would say number one is about disclosure. Number two, I think businesses should take a very clear stance on protecting human rights defenders, and that includes the vulnerable groups. I think that in Thailand, it's very sad, but it still happens every year, where businesses invoke, the defamation lawsuit against the villagers, for example. I think this has to stop. And I think that leading companies can make a very strong statement on why, they see basically SLAPP case as basically a negative, it cannot help improve the human rights situation. So I think this is something that business can do as a one company or as a group of companies to make a stance against prosecuting human rights defenders. And I think last thing that business can do is just following up on what Betty mentioned about a remedy process. Right now, I think in Thailand and many countries as well, there is still quite a lot of distrust, between many companies and the civil societies and the human rights defenders. So I think the opportunity may be to explore alternatives like the mediation process, so that we don't go into this kind of a head-to-head conflict between the villagers on the one hand and the companies, to have this support of a medium brown mediation as a kind of one component to put in the ecosystem. So this is something, the mediation, I think, is something that's interesting. It has not really been done in Thailand. It has only been done in civil cases. But this is something business should also explore in improving their environmental rights and human rights protection as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we're almost out of time, but I think we've covered a lot of ground already in this session, and thank you for those statements from your side as well. I just wanted to mention to the audience also, sorry if we weren't able to get to all of your questions. There were quite a few questions. I hope that we've been able to answer some of them at least, and the organizing team will post relevant links in the question and answer box as well. So if you're looking for some more resources and for further information, have a look in the Q&A box. So the organizing team will post a bit more information there to some of the resources that were also mentioned by speakers. So seeing as we're coming close to the time, I'd like to just quickly give a summary and wrap up. So I think we've heard some very important statements, and you've all raised very important issues on how human rights and the environment are intrinsically linked, and that human rights abuses and environmental degradation are mutually reinforcing. So we've heard also from Stephanie that we really need to further integrate human rights and environmental issues. There's a lot that's already been done, but we need to go further to look at how these interlinkages can be mainstreamed into business decisions, into risk management, and into how business handle their supply chains as well. And we've also heard that we need very practical steps in sharing of good practices and simple access to digestible tools to really understand these interlinkages and to take steps to improve business responsibility. A few of you have already raised that awareness has increased in the region, also with businesses, of human rights and environmental rights, but we need to continue creating this awareness and continue creating the capacity as well to address these issues. Serini, you also highlighted some very important issues, some very important steps. That first, the attitude needs to change toward human rights-based approaches as part of corporate strategies, as part of risk management strategies, that we need to move towards stakeholder protection and stakeholder engagement. So this includes engaging vulnerable groups and protecting environmental rights defenders, and also this push for better disclosure and better standards for the protection of the environment and human rights. And this issue of disclosure was highlighted by a few of you. Betty, you also mentioned how important it is to have transparency as the first step to action, and you mentioned that solutions that will be effective in tackling these environmental issues should also really include mechanisms like the right to participate and access to information and access to remedy. So these are all very important issues to keep in mind on this journey. And Hemanta, thank you as well for your brilliant examples from Sri Lanka, and for highlighting also the role of civil society, especially where maybe legal institutions or frameworks might still be underdeveloped. This need for better law enforcement, but also the important role that guidelines and certifications can play, and the role that civil society and consumers and all of us can play in calling out irresponsible business conduct. So let me just see if I have any more messages from my organizing team. All right. So with this, I would like to thank all of you. If there is any sort of burning final one last sentence that any speakers want to share with us before we go, please raise your hand and jump in. But we've heard so much fantastic information from you already and such great examples. So thank you so much for joining this session. Thank you also to our audience for joining us. We hope that you will continue and stay with us in the forum. There's a lot of fantastic sessions also coming up. There's one on safeguarding civic space for businesses and supporting human rights defenders to safeguard the environment, which is taking place on Friday the 4th. So if you want to hear a bit more about this issue, please tune in. There's also another session that looks specifically at the rights of children and how businesses and other actors can protect those rights and the rights of vulnerable groups, which takes place tomorrow. So go back to the website, have another look at the program, and we thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will stick with us throughout the rest of the forum. please don't hesitate to have a look at the Q&A box, look at the resources, and get in touch with us if you have any further questions. Thank you so much from my side. We'll wrap it up here, and we hope to see you all again soon. Stay safe out there and enjoy the rest of the forum. Goodbye.